Hello, I'm Sandy Boone, owner of ThreeRoomStudio, and I'm so pleased and honored to have been invited by Alice to be part of the ScrapSmarter session. Today's session is all about using stamps to create a scene. Now, I'm primarily a card maker, but I have to say that since meeting Alice and watching some of her scrapbooking sessions on YouTube, I can see that scrapbooking and card making are really not as different as I may have thought. And in fact, some of Alice's tips have really got me thinking about some interactive and personalized elements to apply to some of my cards. So in this video, I'm going to create a scene with two stamp sets, using a few different techniques for masking and coloring. And I'm making a card that is about 9 inches wide, but a similar scene could easily be created at the bottom of a 12 by 12 or letter size sheet of paper. I'm starting out with two pieces of Nina Solar White 110-pound cardstock, both the same size. I think that's about 4 inches by 8.5 inches. One is going to be for my card and the other I'm going to use for my guide. The second one could just be a piece of scrap or printer paper if you don't want to waste your good paper. These two stamp sets are called Believe in Fairies and It's a Ponderful Life, and they are both part of ThreeRoomStudio's new spring release. I've just taken out some of the images to figure out how I want to lay out my scene here. And I have to admit, I really wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I did want to create kind of a busy day in the life of a pond scene. So I'm going to show you how I used some stamping and masking to create dimension in this scene, where some elements are behind others. I'm using a Misty stamp positioner to stamp the images that I think I'm going to need masks for, but you certainly don't need to have one of these. I am just a really terrible stamper, and so I really rely on this tool to save time and paper. I'm using Inkadinkadoo masking paper because that is what I started out with and what I still have, and it's fun to say. But there are also several other brands that work the same way, and I use a variety of things, which you'll see later on in the video. Using very sharp and delicate scissors, I am cutting each image out. I apologize for not showing this better on screen. I have to get right up to see what I'm doing. When I do this, I'm moving the hand holding the paper rather than the one holding the scissors. This makes a much nicer and more fluid cut. And for masks, I cut right into the black outline so that only a little bit of the line is still visible. The reason for this is that since there is some thickness to the paper, you'll always end up with a little bit of a gap where the stamp does not quite make contact with the paper under the mask. And so by cutting away a bit of the image outline, you'll be able to get a closer impression. I'm still deciding on final image placement for the scene, and so I'm using the masks to see what looks best. This stamp set comes with a grass stamp, which has clumps at the bottom to look like where the grass comes out of the ground. But I want this grass to look like it's growing out of the water because it's a pond, and so I'm going to mask the bottom to get a straight edge instead. So for now, I'm just using a ruler and a pencil to indicate about where the back line of the water will be. Okay, now I'm going to stamp out my guide or my template. This will allow me to see how the images will actually look, and I'll also be able to plan which images I want in the front and which will be behind others. The most important thing to remember about stamping images and using a mask is that the image that you want to be in front has to be the one stamped first. Then you apply a mask over that image and then stamp the images you want to appear behind that image right over that stamp and mask. Since this scene is fairly involved, I'm making my life easier by planning in advance and seeing where images will intersect and therefore in what order they need to be stamped. As I mentioned, I had drawn a line in pencil where the back water line is so that I can mask off the bottom of the grass clumps so they appear to be growing out of the water. And so I replicated that in my template. To do this masking, I'm just using some 1-inch post-it tape that comes on a roll. This already has a straight edge and I can just pull off what I need, and it's less expensive than masking paper. It is a bit thicker though, so I know that this will leave a gap, but I'm not concerned about that because this line doesn't need to be absolutely precisely placed, just straight. So I'm continuing on building my scene on a template or a guide, and this is my chance to look it over and change things around a bit and maybe make some notes where I want to change things on the actual scene. I put the template back in the Misty, and here I'm drawing a green line around every image that is in the front of the scene, and so it needs to be stamped first before the images that will appear behind. Once I've done that, I can use the stamped images to line up the stamps and use the door of the Misty to pick up each of the stamps so that I can ink them all up at once and be sure of perfect placement when I switch out the template for the card front piece, which you'll see me do here. After I apply some post-it tape to mask out the toes of the fairy on the left because I want it to look like she's dipping her toes in the water. Then the template goes back in the MISTI, and I draw red lines around the next layer of images, the images that should appear directly behind the ones I've just stamped to appear in the front. And then it's the same process as before, lining the stamps up over the image on the template, picking them up with the door of the MISTI before switching over to the card front. However, this time, before doing any stamping, I'm going to apply the mask over each image first. Now, you really want to take your time lining these up because you'll get a much better result if you take the time on this step. And because I've cut off quite a bit of the outline, it's easy to line up the mask with the image because a little bit of black is poking out the edges. Alright, I was filming this with my phone and it ran out of storage space and I didn't realize it right away. So the footage of me stamping over the first masks does not exist. But I think you'll be able to get the idea anyway, and there are more layers to go after this, so other chances to see. So now that I've got the front images stamped, I want to put in some sky and water before I stamp the grass. I'm using tumbled glass distress ink and a life-changing brush to apply a light layer of ink. I'm applying it very lightly in a circular motion, starting at the edge of the paper and working from the edge into the middle. I want it to be very soft and fade out toward the top because I don't want to lose too much of my white space at the top and in the water, and the water will be reflecting the sky. And in the pond, I switched to a smaller brush and I swiped the color on sideways rather than using a circular motion, but I tested on a scrap piece of paper first before applying it to the paper every time I reloaded the brush because I didn't want any harsh lines. And again, I didn't want to lose that white space. I just want a hint of the sky's reflection in the water. That pencil line is the divider, and I do wish I had erased or at least lightened that line up a bit because once the ink is over top, that line is not budging, but it turned out fine in the end. So I also added a bit of crushed olive distress ink in the space between the sky and the pond, about where the grass will be and where it will be reflected in the water. I chose this color because it's similar to the color of the first layer of grass I'm going to be stamping, and so it'll look like there is more grass behind it in the distance. So just like on the template, I'm applying a line of that post-it tape to mask the bottom of the grass. And I'm sure that you'll notice that the grass stamp is stained. That is fine. Some inks will do that on good quality stamps, but the stamp is still perfectly fine if the color does not come out after a good scrubbing with gentle soap and water. Now, I'm not sure what color that ink was that I used for the grass. I was still a little rattled after the phone fiasco. So it was either Simon Says Stamp Golden Locks Premium Dye Ink or Gina K Designs Skeleton Leaves Amalgam Ink. You'll see that I'm using a piece of acetate to help me line up the stamp again, and that is because I wasn't 100% certain that the stamp was clean, and I didn't want to accidentally get ink all over the place while I was trying to line things up. So with the acetate, I can move it around, place it where I want it, and pick it up with the door of the MISTI and then peel the acetate off. Also, to minimize the gap between the stamp image and the mask, I actually stood up to press the stamp down hard and get it as close as possible to the edge. With solid image stamps, you can sometimes get an air bubble that will affect your stamped image. And you also really want to take your time to make sure you're getting some good contact with the paper. So sometimes you might have to stamp it more than once. And a stamp positioner comes in really handy for that when you want to make sure you're stamping in exactly the same spot every time. Here I've applied a mask again, just below the first grass masking, because I want to stamp another layer of grass in a darker color. This darker color will make the grass appear closer in the front, and the lighter color in the back will suggest that the grass is farther away, so it will look more realistic. This time I used Simon Says Stamp Beanstalk Green Premium Dye Ink, and I made sure to start the image in a different spot this time so that the grass wouldn't look exactly the same on the front and the back layers. I also stamped a couple more clumps of grass at the very front in an even darker color green, Simon Says Stamp Evergreen Premium Dye Ink, and I also stamped some of those cattail images, but I didn't worry about masking those because I'm going to be coloring those in with a darker color ink than the stamped images behind them. So as you can see, I removed the masks, and that's the magic part. The big reveal after all the inking, and that never gets old to me. You can see, since I cut the masks very close to the inside of the outline, that there is no white space between the image and the inky background. Now, this is not a coloring video, so I'm not going to show you a lot of coloring. What I am trying to show you though is coloring alternatives such as ink blending. I did color the skin and the hair of these fairies, but coloring is not everybody's thing. I love it, but I'm realizing that there are people who like to color and there are people who like to ink. There are some people who like to do both, but that's why I'm designing more stamps that can be used by the people who like to ink. So if you're not a coloring person, a fun alternative is paper piecing. And I know scrapbookers have lots of patterned paper. So for the fairies' dresses, I'm going to stamp the images on patterned paper and I'll cut out their clothing similar to the way I cut out the masking paper. However, this time I'm going to cut on the outside edge of the outline because I want to incorporate the line into the image. Again, I'll use the small sharp scissors for this very detailed work. Leave out any small lines such as antennae. Those will already be stamped on the paper, so you don't need to cut them out again. Once the pieces are cut, you can just go ahead and glue them onto the images and it will look perfect. Or if you want to spend a bit more time, just take a gray marker or a colored pencil and add some shading first. I also like to go around the piece I've just cut out with a black Tombow or any other water-based marker just to touch up the cut edge. This really finishes the piece off so you can hardly even see the pieces cut out, and it's also very forgiving if your cut lines are not 100% perfect. I find using a Copic marker for this tends to bleed a little bit too far into the paper and it makes the lines look messy. It works best if you do this from the back to avoid accidentally marking up the front, and I can tell you that happens really easily, even if you think you're being very careful. So to finish this off, I have colored the hair and the wings, although the wings would be really beautiful paper pieced, especially with some vellum or paper with a bit of glitter in it. I colored mine and went over them with a bit of Wink of Stella glitter brush, and now I'm stamping some of the smaller flying critters in the stamp set with Gina K Designs black amalgam ink. This is my favorite black ink and it works with alcohol markers, pencils, and watercolor too. Another fun touch that anyone can do, even if you don't color, is to use a white Jelly Roll pen to add some white details, just some dots and lines. This will really make your images pop. To get the ink flowing, I make little circles on the back of my hand until the ink starts to get nice and thick and opaque. You can do this on paper too, but the heat of your hand really seems to help get things moving. Whenever I finish working on a project, I usually have inky fingers and a bunch of white on the back of my hand. So to assemble my card, I have cut a piece of Neenah Solar White 110-pound paper to about 1/4 inch larger than the card front, and I'm just going around the edges with a Copic marker in a color that coordinates with one of the blues I used to color the images. I don't actually have a lot of patterned paper because I don't use a lot of it in card making, but this is a good trick if you don't have the color paper you want, but you do have markers in 358 colors. Full set syndrome is a thing. I adhered the card to the piece I just colored and adhered that onto a card base using liquid glue, and that is it. Thank you so much to Alice Bowl for inviting me to this ScrapSmarter session on stamping a scene, and thank you all so much for watching. I hope you find these tips helpful. I hope you learned something new. I hope you have a great day, and please feel free to reach out to me. Bye!